I've seen a lot in my family's diner. I've seen proposals over pancakes, breakups over burgers, and more Sunday morning gossip than a small-town newspaper. But I've never seen anything like the morning those three guys walked in. They thought they were picking on a quiet old man. They thought they were the main characters. They had no idea that in our little corner of the world, they just walked into a history lesson, and the final exam was going to be a heavy dose of humility, served up right alongside the coffee and pie. The sun was just hitting the streets of Bakersfield that morning, giving everything that warm, hazy California glow. Lou's Diner, our place, sits on the corner of 19th and H. It's squeezed between a laundromat that's seen better days and a hardware store that's been boarded up for years. The big sign out front has a flicker in the O, but we never fix it. It's part of the charm, you know? People don't come to us for fancy decor. They come because it feels like stepping into a memory. The air inside always smells the same. A perfect mix of bacon, coffee, and my dad's fresh-baked biscuits. It's the smell of a good morning. The booths are red vinyl, and most of them have a tear here or there, patched up with silver duct tape. We're not proud of the tape, but we're not ashamed of it either. It shows we're lived in. The walls are a scrapbook of the town. You've got sun-bleached newspaper clippings about local heroes, old photos of high school football teams where the kids look way older than they were, and a big, slightly crooked American flag hanging by the counter. It's not a five-star restaurant, but it's home. And every single Sunday, at 8 a.m. on the dot, Eugene Marshall would walk through that door. He never made a big scene. No loud greetings, no fuss. He'd just push the door open, give a quiet nod to anyone who looked his way, and say, "Morning, Lou." Even though the original Lou, my grandfather, hadn't run the place in almost 20 years. My dad kept the name. Eugene always headed for the same spot, the second booth by the window. It was the perfect location, really. Close enough to get the morning sun on his face, but far enough from the hustle of the counter to be left in peace. He always wore his army jacket. Not one of those new, stylish ones, but a real M65, the old olive drab kind. He told me once he got it in '69. It was amazing how it still fit him, even though the fabric was getting thin and the cuffs of the sleeves were starting to fray. On the back, right below the collar, was a hand-stitched patch. The letters were faded, but you could still make out 101st and the image of the screaming eagle. Some people probably thought he wore it for attention, trying to relive some glory days. But I knew better. After all these years, it was just the only jacket that felt right on his shoulders. He'd sit down, and out of habit, he'd slide the sugar dispenser just a little to the left, lining it up with the edge of the napkin holder. Then he'd wait. He never needed a menu. Everyone on staff, from Marcy, our head waitress, to me in the kitchen, knew Eugene's order by heart. Black coffee, strong, no sugar, no cream, and one slice of my mom's apple pie, but it had to be a corner piece, the kind that gets a little extra crust, slightly burned around the edges. He liked the crunch. We all knew to give him his space. The regulars did too. It wasn't out of fear or anything like that. It was just plain respect. Eugene wasn't a big talker. He chose his words carefully, like each one had a cost. You could tell he'd spent a lifetime figuring out when to speak up and when it was better to just stay quiet. He was 78, and while his knees were starting to give him trouble, you could see it in his slow, deliberate walk. His posture was still ramrod straight. He sat in that booth like a soldier on watch, back straight, head up, hands steady on the table. Every once in a while, a kid would get curious and ask him about the patches on his jacket. Eugene would get this gentle smile on his face, lean down, and tell a quick story. But it was never about him. It was always about the bravery of someone else in his unit, a friend who did something heroic. He never, ever made himself the hero of his own stories. On this particular Sunday, I was peeking out from the kitchen window, watching the dining room. I always liked seeing Eugene. He was one of my favorites. I'd always make sure to give him an extra scoop of apples in his pie when my dad wasn't looking. I'll never forget. One time he tasted it and looked over at me with this serious expression. He said, "Boy, if your kitchen had legs, I'd marry it." We both just burst out laughing. It was the longest I'd ever seen him laugh. The diner was slowly filling up. Just the usual Sunday crowd. A couple in a booth sharing the newspaper, a young mom trying to build a tower out of napkins to keep her toddler entertained, and old Mr. Henderson nursing his grits and gravy. A perfectly normal, quiet morning. I saw Marcy bring Eugene his coffee and pie. He stirred the coffee once, took a bite of the pie, and leaned back with his eyes half closed. For a second, he looked so peaceful, like he was a million miles away, somewhere younger, somewhere quieter. But he didn't even get to his second bite. The front door swung open. And it wasn't just opened, it was slammed back against the stopper, making the little bell on top jingle like crazy. It was one of those entrances that screams, "Look at me." 3 young men, probably in their mid-20s, swaggered in. They were all fashion, from the flashy sneakers to the arrogant smirks. The air in the diner just changed. It was like a cold front had moved in. Their laughter was way too loud for the room. One of them, wearing a big puffer jacket even though it was already getting warm outside, had a Bluetooth speaker clipped to his belt, blasting some tinny rap music that nobody wanted to hear. I looked up from the grill, my brow furrowing. I hate it when people do that. This is a family place, not a nightclub. The men were loud, obnoxious, pointing and laughing. One of them said something about old heads hogging all the good booths, and then he pointed directly at Eugene. In that instant, the entire atmosphere of the diner shifted. You could feel it. The quiet chatter stopped. People looked up from their food, then quickly looked back down. Nobody said a word. Not the customers, not Marcy, not me. We were all just holding our breath, waiting, hoping they were just passing through. You could practically smell the arrogance coming off them. The one who seemed to be the leader, or at least the one with the biggest mouth, had a backwards baseball cap and a smirk that looked like it was tattooed on his face. We found out later his name was Troy Delaney. Flanking him was Reggie Finn, a taller, skinnier guy who was constantly bouncing on the balls of his feet like a kid on a sugar high. The third one, Darnell Holmes, hung back a bit. He was wearing sunglasses indoors, trying to look cool and detached, and he spoke every sentence like it was a challenge. Troy scanned the room like he was a king surveying his property. His eyes swept past the first few booths and then locked onto Eugene. And they stayed there. "Damn, y'all see Grandpa G.I. Joe over here?" he said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. He jerked his thumb towards Eugene's booth. Bet he stormed Normandy with a cane. Reggie let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. Man, he probably thinks this place still takes war rations for a slice of pie. A couple of people let out nervous little chuckles, the kind you make when you don't want to become the next target. Most people just stared down at their plates, wishing the whole thing would just blow over. But Eugene? He didn't even flinch. He just calmly reached for his coffee mug, his hand as steady as a rock, and took a long sip. The commotion didn't seem to touch him. From my spot in the kitchen, I leaned forward, my jaw clenched so tight it started to ache. I did not like the tone in their voices. I didn't like them targeting him. But I was still in that phase of watching, trying to figure out if they were just idiots who would eventually settle down, or if they had come in looking to start something. Troy walked right past the empty booths, straight to Eugene's table, and leaned on it with one hand, getting right in his personal space. "Hey, Pops," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "What's with the army costume? You playing dress up this morning?" Reggie laughed again. "Yeah, tell us a war story, old man. Did you wrestle Hitler yourself, or did you just babysit the tanks?" Darnell was still over by the jukebox, pretending to be busy with his phone, trying to act like he wasn't part of it. But he was. They were a pack. One to provoke, one to amplify, and one to play lookout. Finally, Eugene looked up. His eyes weren't angry or scared. They were just clear and still. It was the kind of quiet gaze that makes you rethink what you're doing. "You boys got nothing better to do this morning?" he asked. His voice was low, but it cut through the noise. It was firm. Troy just tilted his head, that stupid smirk still on his face. "We're just talking, man. Freedom of speech, right, soldier?" That was it for me. I'd heard enough. I ripped off my apron, wiped my hands on a towel, and pushed through the swinging kitchen doors. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked over to the main counter. Marcy, who's been waitressing here since before I was born and has nerves of steel, gave me a look. A look that said, "Be careful, kid." I nodded, then looked away. Over at the booth, Eugene set his fork down, very deliberately, and leaned back a little. He still hadn't broken eye contact with Troy. "You get your laughs by messing with old folks?" Eugene asked, his voice still level. "Nah," Troy shot back with a chuckle. "Just trying to understand why someone's still wearing that dusty-ass jacket like it actually means something." From a booth behind Eugene, someone muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "It does mean something, you idiot." Troy's head whipped around. "What was that?" he snapped at the room. Complete silence. Nobody answered. That's when I started moving. I came around the counter and started walking slowly toward Eugene's booth. Darnell, the one by the jukebox, finally spoke up, probably sensing things were about to escalate. "Man, y'all are tripping. He ain't even doing nothing. Just some old vet stuck in the past. Let it go." But Reggie didn't let it go. He stepped even closer to Eugene, way too close. The air got thick. You could feel the shift from bad taste joking to real, ugly tension. Reggie tapped his fingers on the table, right next to Eugene's pie. "What's the matter, old timer? Can't hear us? You got were flashbacks or something? Wanna cry on your pie?" I stopped right behind Eugene's booth. My hands were balled into fists at my sides. My voice came out low, but it was sharp. "That's enough." Troy turned to face me. "And who are you?" "His grandson." I ignored the question. I took another step forward so I was standing right beside Eugene's shoulder, a clear sign that he wasn't alone. "Do you have any idea who this is?" I asked them, looking from Troy to Reggie. Troy just blinked, thrown off for a second. "What? Like he's some kind of celebrity or something?" I didn't answer him. I just looked at Eugene, who still hadn't looked away from them. The silence in the diner was deafening. It was like a thunderstorm was rolling in, but without the thunder, just that heavy, electric feeling in the air. Everybody had stopped pretending not to watch. I looked at Reggie, then Troy, then Darnell. "You want to clown on somebody? Fine. Take it outside. But you do not." I lowered my voice even more. "You do not come in here and disrespect this man." Reggie scoffed. "What? Is he your dad or something?" I turned my body just slightly, facing them more directly. My voice was still calm, but there was no mistaking the warning in it. "No, but I'd be damned lucky if he was." Just then, Eugene raised his hand, just a fraction of an inch. A small, simple gesture. "Let them talk, Luis," he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. Sometimes, ignorance needs an audience before it can properly embarrass itself. Troy laughed again, but it didn't have the same confidence. It was shaky. Something was definitely shifting. The audience he thought he had was turning on him. At a table near the window, an older white man, a regular named Mr. Gable, slowly set down his newspaper. "That man," he said, his voice clear and strong, "saved my cousin's life in Vietnam." A woman at the counter spun around on her stool. "Mine too," she added. "He dragged my brother through the jungle for 2 days after he was hit. Lost half his own blood doing it." Even Marcy, our waitress, stepped forward from behind the counter. "You boys," she said, pointing a finger at them, "have no idea who you're messing with." But they didn't leave. Not yet. Their pride was too big, and they still hadn't heard the whole story. Troy took a step back, his eyes darting around the room. The change in the atmosphere was undeniable now. It was pressing in on his ego like a physical force. People weren't laughing with him anymore. They were staring at him. Still, he tried to regain control. "Oh, so now this whole place worships old soldiers," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too desperate. "A man wears a jacket and suddenly he's a superhero?" Reggie laughed with him, but it sounded hollow and forced. He glanced at Eugene, then around at the other customers. You could see his confidence leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. Darnell was still frozen by the jukebox, but he wasn't pretending to be on his phone anymore. His arms were crossed over his chest, his jaw tight. He was watching. Eugene let out a slow, long breath. He picked up his napkin, folded it neatly into a square, and placed it on the table beside his plate. He looked up at Troy, and that calm, level gaze of his was back. "You ever been shot at, son?" he asked. The question dropped into the silence like a stone in a pond. "You ever held a friend while he bled out in the mud, calling for a mother he hadn't seen in years?" Troy didn't have an answer for that. He just stood there, his mouth slightly open. "Didn't think so," Eugene said, his voice soft but sharp as a razor. "So maybe you ought to be quiet before you embarrass yourself any further." Troy's jaw clenched. I saw his eyes flicker toward the front door, like he was doing the math, trying to figure out if it was better to cut his losses and walk out, or to double down and push things even further. Reggie, for some reason, chose to push. He leaned in over Eugene's table again, planting his palms flat on the surface like he was about to deliver some brilliant, final insult. "Man, you think just cause you fought in some stupid war that people owe you something? Nobody asked you to sign up." I stepped even closer, my eyes locked on Reggie. "He didn't ask for anything," I said, my voice tight. but you owe him more than you will ever understand. Oh, please, Troy scoffed, finding his voice again. Let me guess, here comes the sob story. The war hero comes back, gets no respect, fights racism, all that classic stuff. That's when another voice cut through the tension, this one from a corner booth. It was Mrs. Davis, a woman in her 70s who always wore a leopard print scarf and drank tea with 3 lemons. You little punks, she said, her voice shaking with anger, have no idea what he fought when he came home. You think coming back to Bakersfield after Vietnam was some kind of celebration? He came back to hate. People spat on his boots. Doors were slammed in his face. He fought one war for this country, and then he had to come home and fight a whole other one right here. Eugene didn't say a word. He just sat there, listening, as if all these stories were about someone else. I looked at the 3 of them, at their confused, angry faces. You ever get denied a job because of the uniform you wore? I asked. You ever have to drink from a separate water fountain after you risked your life for people who wouldn't even share a sidewalk with you? Troy looked genuinely uncomfortable now. The smirk was long gone. Reggie had taken a step back, trying to distance himself from the table. Man, you're making this real dramatic, he mumbled. Marcy's voice boomed from behind the counter. It is dramatic. It's his life. You boys wouldn't last 10 minutes in Eugene's shoes. Darnell, the quiet one, finally moved. He pushed himself off the jukebox and walked forward, slow and deliberate, his sunglasses still hiding his eyes. He stopped just a few feet from the booth. All right, fine, he said, holding up his hands. He's a vet. He went through some stuff. That still don't give him a pass to walk around like the whole world owes him. Eugene looked up at Darnell, but his voice was still calm, without a trace of anger. I have never asked the world for a single thing, he said. I just came in here to enjoy a slice of pie, like I've done every Sunday for the last 19 years. The fact that my presence in this room makes you feel small, that's not on me. That's on you. I crossed my arms. You boys wanted an audience, I said to them. Well, now you've got one. And from the look of things, you don't have the first clue what to do with it. Suddenly, another man stood up near the window. It was Mr. Jennings, a guy who walked with crutches. He had one leg. His voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. Eugene pulled me out of a collapsed building in Hugh City. I was 19 years old. He could have saved himself. He was already out. Instead, he came back in for me. He tapped the tip of one of his crutches on the linoleum floor for emphasis. So yeah, I'd say he's earned a little goddamn respect. The silence that followed was heavy. You could have heard a pin drop. Troy looked around the diner, his eyes wide. Nobody was on his side. Not a single person. Even his 2 friends had turned inward, looking like kids who'd just been caught in a lie. Eugene finally pushed his plate away. He hadn't finished his pie, but it didn't seem to matter anymore. I don't wear this jacket for attention, he said, his voice low as he brushed a non-existent crumb off the sleeve. I wear it to remember the men who never got the chance to make it home and take theirs off. But even then, they hadn't heard the part of the story that would change everything. The diner was still, the air thick with unspoken history. The low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed way too loud. All eyes were on Eugene, and on the 3 young men who had walked in like they owned the world and were now shrinking in the middle of it. I stayed right there, standing beside Eugene. My jaw was still tight, but my eyes were steady. This was more than just defending a customer now. This was personal. I remembered being 12 years old and watching Mr. Marshall change a flat tire for my mom on the side of the road in the middle of a brutal August heat wave. He never asked for a dime, just told her to be safe. Back then, he was just Mr. Marshall, the quiet man from down the street. I didn't know about the war. I didn't know about the medals he kept in a box under his bed. I didn't know about the years he spent trying to rebuild a life that had been torn apart not once, but twice. First in the jungles of Vietnam, and then again when he came back home. Troy was fidgeting, rubbing the back of his neck. His tough guy act had completely shattered, but his pride was a stubborn thing. It wouldn't let him just turn and walk out. He gestured toward the jacket again, a last, desperate attempt to find solid ground. Man, you keep talking about this jacket, like you're some kind of legend or something. That's when a new voice joined in, a heavy voice from behind us. It was Ramon, our cook. Ramon usually kept to himself. He was a man of few words unless those words were about brisket or seasoning. But now, he was stepping out of the kitchen, his white apron still on, a dusting of flour on his powerful arms. Legend, Ramon said, and his voice filled the diner. He is Troy turned, his brows raised in disbelief. You like baseball? Ramon asked him directly. Reggie shrugged. Yes, so? You know the name Vernon Dorsey? Reggie's eyes blinked. Yeah, pitcher, right? From back in the day. Played for Stockdale High. He was my cousin, Ramon said, and the words hung in the air. First black kid to get a baseball scholarship out of Stockdale High. Got drafted by the majors. But he got drafted by the Army first. He never came back. Ramon's eyes were locked on Troy. You know why? Troy didn't answer. No one did. Because a landmine took off half his chest, Ramon said, his voice raw. Eugene was the one who carried what was left of him back to the medic tent. He stayed by his side. He held his hand while he died. Then he wrote a letter to our family and sent his dog tags home himself. Ramon's voice cracked, but it didn't break. My uncle kept that letter tucked inside his Bible until the day he passed away. Eugene didn't say a thing. He just looked down into his coffee cup, which was cold by now. Darnell shifted on his feet. All right, okay, man. We get it. No, you don't. Marcy snapped from behind the counter. You think you get to walk into a place like this, our place, and toss insults around and laugh at a man who has lived through more horror than you could ever even imagine? Let me tell you something. She pointed a trembling finger at Eugene. This man lost more friends in a single year than you will ever make in your entire lifetime. People who hadn't said a word before were nodding now. Eyes were meeting across the room. The walls of silence that had separated all the booths were cracking, and this old, run-down diner that usually just served up eggs and local gossip had become something else. A courtroom, a classroom, a church. Troy looked like he was about to say something, to argue again, but I cut him off. You boys wanted to show off, I said. Okay. You came in loud. You thought nobody would say anything back. Maybe you're used to that. But this isn't that kind of place. Reggie just mumbled. Man, we didn't know. I held up a hand. You didn't want to know. That's different. Eugene finally looked up again. His eyes weren't tired anymore. They were sharp. You ever wonder what happens when a man who has been through hell decides he just wants to live in peace, and then gets mocked for the scars he carries? Troy looked away. Eugene continued, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of decades. It's not just the disrespect. It's the reminder. The reminder that no matter how much you give, some people will always try to measure your worth by what they think they see on the surface. I turned toward the kitchen for a second, thinking about my dad, and then looked back at Eugene. Should I tell them about the photo? I asked him softly. Eugene shook his head slightly. No need. They wouldn't understand it anyway. What photo? Darnell asked. His voice was different now. Cautious. Curious. I hesitated, then decided they needed to hear it. There's a picture in my dad's safe. It's from 1972. It's of Eugene carrying a wounded little girl through a burning village. The kid's barefoot, there's blood everywhere. But Eugene's face, it's calm. Focused. That picture is in a frame, under glass. It's the only thing my dad made sure to grab when we moved from our first little restaurant to this place. I looked at the three of them, making sure they understood. That little girl? That was my uncle. A beat of silence passed, heavy and profound. Eugene saved his life, I said to them, my voice thick. He lived. He got to grow up and have a family. And that family includes me. But that still wasn't the whole story. It wasn't the thing that Eugene lost. The part that never made it into a letter or a photograph. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The anger in the room had evaporated, and in its place was something heavier. A deep, personal ache. You could see it in the way people were looking at Eugene now. It wasn't just respect anymore. It was sorrow. It was regret. I pulled out one of the chairs from the next table and set it beside Eugene's booth. I didn't sit, just rested one hand on the back of it, trying to ground myself. There's something else, I said, looking right at them. Something none of you asked about, but you should have. Eugene let out a soft, weary sigh. I knew he didn't want this part told. He never talked about it. But it was too late. I wasn't trying to embarrass him. I was trying to make them finally, truly, understand. He had a wife, I said. Her name was Margaret. She used to come in here with him, years and years ago. Sweetest lady you'd ever meet. She wore this little gold bracelet every single Sunday, even though it was missing one of the stones. She told my mom it was a gift from Eugene, from right before he shipped out for his first tour. Eugene didn't look up. His hands were lying flat on the table now, palms down. She waited for him. I continued, my voice low. She waited for him through 2 full tours in Vietnam. She held their home together, worked night shifts at the hospital, saved every penny she could to buy a second-hand crib for the baby they were expecting. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. But Margaret died. She died the day before Eugene was scheduled to return home for good. You could hear people gasp. Soft, sharp intakes of breath all around the diner. It was a car accident, I said, forcing the words out. Right on Union Avenue. A drunk driver blew through a red light. She was on her way home from her shift at the hospital. He didn't even know she was gone. He stepped off the bus at the station downtown, and a neighbor had to be the one to meet him there and tell him the news. Eugene slowly leaned back, pressing his shoulders hard into the vinyl of the booth. We'd already picked out the baby's name, he said, and his voice was so low, it was almost a whisper, like he was just talking to himself. Girl or a boy, it was going to be Jordan. We didn't care. We just wanted the child to be healthy. He swallowed hard, and I could see the muscles in his jaw working. I missed the funeral. By 3 hours. There were plane delays out of Saigon. His voice broke on that last word. I never even got to say goodbye. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, Troy's entire expression changed. The arrogance, the anger, the confusion, it all melted away and was replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. He blinked fast, his lips slightly parted. Reggie turned his face away completely, staring at the floor. Darnell, the tough guy in the sunglasses, slowly raised a hand and covered his mouth. Marcy stepped out from behind the counter with a fresh, steaming cup of coffee. She didn't say a word. She just placed it gently on the table in front of Eugene and gave his shoulder a soft, quiet squeeze. I looked at the three young men. So when you laugh at that jacket, I said, my voice shaking with an emotion I couldn't even name. When you call him names, when you act like his very presence here is some kind of a joke you're entitled to make. You're mocking a man who has already given this world more than you will ever be asked to. You're laughing at a ghost. Troy finally found his voice, but it was just a croak. I didn't know. I didn't know any of that, man. Eugene gave a soft, incredibly tired laugh. No, you didn't, he said. And you didn't want to. There was a long, heavy pause. Then Mr. Jennings, the man with the crutches, spoke up again. You didn't know because you never thought to ask, he said, his voice firm. That's the whole problem right there. You assume, and then you mock. But you never, ever listen. Mrs. Davis, the woman with the leopard scarf, added, you boys are lucky. You're lucky you grew up in a world that people like Eugene made safer for you, so you could have the luxury of acting like complete and utter fools. Reggie just whispered, we were just messing around. We didn't mean it like that. Eugene looked up, and his eyes, which had seen so much, were just filled with a profound weariness. I fought so that people in this country could speak freely, he said. But I didn't fight so that they could forget the cost of that freedom. That single sentence hit harder than any shout ever could have. I just nodded slowly. Exactly. Troy shifted his weight, looking desperately uncomfortable. Look, I'm sorry. All right. Eugene didn't answer right away. He just studied the young man's face, like he was trying to see if the apology was genuine, or if it was just an escape hatch from the shame. Don't say you're sorry if you're only saying it because you got caught, he said, his voice even and clear. Say it if you're going to carry the truth of this morning with you after you walk out that door. Troy's mouth opened, then closed. He couldn't speak. He just gave a slow, reluctant nod. Reggie, who was now visibly shaken, said, I had no clue about any of this. I swear. Darnell added, me neither. We were just being dumb. Eugene's hand rested on the rim of his new coffee cup. Being dumb is one thing, he said. Choosing to stay that way, that's another. But it wasn't over. The real turning point, the moment that showed if anything had actually changed, was still to come. Troy was silent now. Reggie was hiding behind him, staring at his shoes like they held the secrets to the universe. Darnell was still leaning against the jukebox, his arms folded tight, but the sunglasses weren't a shield anymore. You could feel the shame coming off him in waves. The entire dynamic of the diner had been flipped on its head. They'd walked in like kings, and now they looked like three little kids who'd just been dressed down by the principal in front of the entire school. And it wasn't yelling that did it. It was truth. And truth stings a whole lot more when you realize you walked right into it by your own choice. Eugene took a sip of the fresh coffee Marcy had brought. He didn't flinch at the heat. He never flinched. His hands were still steady. even after having the deepest wounds of his past ripped open in front of a room full of strangers. But the feeling in the room had changed again. The tension was gone. In its place was respect. Real, earned respect. The kind that doesn't need to be announced. Troy cleared his throat. "Mr. Marshall," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I mean it." Eugene gave him a single, slight nod. Reggie stepped forward. "We shouldn't have said what we said. We didn't know your story. That don't excuse it. I know that. But still." I stood there quietly, my arms crossed, watching them. "You came in here looking to laugh at someone," I said. "That was the goal. You weren't just having fun. You were trying to knock someone else down so you could feel a little taller." Reggie didn't even try to argue. "I know. And the thing is," I continued, "you picked the wrong man. Not because he's some untouchable legend carved in stone, but because he has already been through more hell than you could ever throw at him. And he carried it. He carried it all with dignity." Darnell finally pushed himself off the jukebox and stepped forward. "We came in acting stupid," he said. "That's on us. I get it now." Mr. Jennings let out a short, dry chuckle. "You get it now, 'cause the whole town's staring at you." It stung, but it was honest. Then something happened that none of us expected. A teenage girl sitting in one of the back booths, maybe 16 or 17, wearing a hoodie and a pair of worn-out Vans, stood up. She walked right over to Eugene's table. She pulled a small, spiral notebook out of her backpack, flipped it open to a half-written page, and held it out to him with a pen. Would you mind writing down your name?" she asked, her voice soft. "I want to remember it." Eugene looked genuinely surprised. He took the little notebook from her and handled it so gently, like it was made of fragile glass. He took Marcy's pen from the counter and didn't just sign his name. He wrote, "Eugene Marshall, Infantry, 101st Airborne Division." He handed it back to her. The girl clutched it to her chest like it was a backstage pass to a better world, and she walked back to her seat without another word. The whole room seemed to soften after that. The frozen silence broke. People weren't whispering or staring anymore. They were looking at Eugene in a new way, not as some relic from the past, but as a man they were finally, truly seeing for the first time. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and looked at Troy, Reggie, and Darnell. So I asked, "What now?" Troy glanced around the room, at all the faces watching him. "We leave," he said quietly. I gave a slow nod. That'd probably be best. They turned for the door. Darnell went first, then Reggie followed, his shoulders slumped. Troy was the last one. He paused at the door and turned back one more time. He looked right at Eugene. If you ever wanted to talk to someone," he said, stumbling over the words, "or maybe even tell more of your story, I'd listen." Eugene gave him a slow, sad smile. It was the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes, but it said everything it needed to. "Then maybe you should start by listening to the folks all around you," he said. "There are stories all over this place. It just takes a good set of ears and a little bit of humility to hear them." Troy just nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. And then he finally walked out. The little bell on the door jingled as it closed. But this time, they didn't slam it. They pulled it shut, gently. I turned to Eugene. "You all right?" He was looking out the window. The morning light had softened. "I'm fine, Luis," he said. "Didn't plan on giving a history lesson today, but I guess life had other ideas." But there was still one more thing he needed to say. And this time, it wasn't for the boys who had left. It was for all of us who had stayed. After the doors shut, a completely different kind of silence fell over the diner. It wasn't tense or awkward anymore. It was thoughtful, respectful, like we all knew we'd just been a part of something important, but nobody wanted to be the first to break the spell. Eugene sat back in his booth. His pie was still mostly uneaten. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look tired anymore. He just looked still, like a mountain that knew exactly where it stood. I stepped away from his table to give him some room, but I stayed close by. I had a feeling he wasn't done. And he wasn't. He reached for his cup, took a final sip of the now lukewarm coffee, and set it down with a soft click. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You know," he said, his eyes sweeping across the faces watching him. "When I came home in '72, I didn't expect a parade. I'd seen too much to care about flags and speeches. All I wanted was peace. Just a quiet life. A job. A family." He paused, his gaze dropping to his plate. But peace didn't come easy. I wore this same jacket back then. Not because I wanted attention, but because it was the only thing I owned that hadn't been taken from me. And every time I walked into a store or sat down on a park bench, somebody would look at me like I didn't belong. A low murmur went through the diner. Heads nodded. Faces tightened with a shared, painful memory of that time. Sometimes, Eugene continued, they called me names. Sometimes they'd cross the street to avoid me. But most of the time, they just said nothing at all. And that silence is worse than any word. Because it means they've already decided you aren't even worth the breath it would take to speak. He looked up again, his eyes locking with no one and everyone at the same time. And I learned something back then. You can't make people respect you. You can only live in a way that demands it. Not with force, but with truth. By standing up when it's easier to sit down. By walking away when your pride is screaming at you to swing. A woman near the window quietly wiped her eye with a napkin. Those boys today, they were just noise, Eugene said. I've heard louder. I've faced worse. What hurts isn't the jokes or the ignorance. It's how easy it is for everyone else to just sit there and say nothing. How fast we all pretend we don't hear. He glanced over at Marcy, who looked back at him with glassy eyes. Don't get me wrong. I'm not angry. I've lived long enough to know that anger is a fire that only burns the one who's holding it. But I am disappointed. Marcy stepped closer. We should have said something sooner, Eugene, she said, her voice thick. I should have. Eugene shook his head gently. I'm not here to scold anybody. That's not why I come here every Sunday. I come for the pie, and for the quiet. He paused. But maybe quiet isn't always what we need. I spoke up from behind the counter. Maybe we need to be louder, I said. For the right reasons. Eugene gave a small, real smile. Exactly. Then he turned his attention to the younger customers still in the diner. The girl with the notebook, a couple of college kids in a back booth, a boy who looked about 16 staring with wide eyes. You don't have to go to war to be brave, he said to them. Sometimes, it's brave just to speak up when you see someone being torn down. Even if it's not you. Especially when it's not you. The boy in the back gave a slow, deliberate nod, like he was downloading the words directly into his brain. And one day, Eugene added, when you see someone getting laughed at for something they didn't choose, their age, their skin, their story, you'll remember this morning. You'll remember how fast things can turn. You'll remember how small and ugly cruelty really looks when truth finally decides to walk into the room. He looked down at his half-eaten pie, then back up at all of us. Now, he said, brushing his hands together on his pants, if nobody minds, I'd really like to finish my breakfast. That got a few laughs. Quiet laughs, but real ones. And just like that, the last of the tension finally broke. But outside our diner walls, the story of this morning was already starting to travel, and the lesson wasn't going to stay inside for long. It didn't take long at all. By the time the lunch rush started shuffling in, the whispers had already made their way up and down 19th Street. Somebody had posted a blurry photo on a local community page. It was of Eugene sitting in his booth with me standing beside him. The caption just said, this man just shut down 3 bullies at Lou's Diner without even raising his voice. It got shared, and then it got reshared. People didn't have all the details, but they felt the power in that image. They saw the quiet stillness and knew it carried weight. All across town, in barbershops and church basements and office break rooms, the story was being told in pieces. The old vet, the loudmouth kids. The moment the whole diner stood up, people would lean in a little closer, wanting to hear more. Names started getting passed around. Not just Eugene's, but Troy Delaney's too. And not in a good way. By that evening, Troy was feeling the heat. His aunt called him, not to ask what happened, but to tell him what she'd heard from her neighbor. A coworker brought it up to him during his shift at the warehouse. Even one of his old high school football coaches sent him a text message. What you did in that diner today, you better find a way to fix it, son, or you'll be carrying it for a long, long time. I can just imagine him, sitting alone in his car that night in some fast food parking lot, watching his phone screen light up with notifications he was too scared to even read. Regret isn't a lightning bolt. It's a slow, creeping burn. He was probably thinking about coming back to the diner, maybe the next day, maybe with his mom, maybe to say something to Eugene, face to face. He probably had no idea if it would even matter. Back at our place, Eugene had finished his pie and coffee hours ago. He was long gone home, but his booth, the second one by the window, stayed empty for the rest of the day. Nobody sat there. It wasn't forbidden or anything. It just felt wrong, like trying to sit in the king's throne. Marcy still wiped it down twice, humming to herself, like she was clearing out more than just a few crumbs. I stayed late that night, long after we'd closed up. I was sitting at the counter, just turning the whole day over and over in my head. "You all right, kid?" Marcy asked me as she finished mopping. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking. About Eugene. About all of it." She poured me a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for and set it down gently in front of me. "We see so much these days, don't we?" she said. "Videos, posts, headlines, it's all just noise. But it's different when it happens right here, right in front of you." I stared into the dark liquid in my cup. It made me realize how many times I've probably stayed quiet when I shouldn't have, I admitted. Marcy put her mop away and leaned against the counter. "Honey," she whispered, "we all have." We just sat there for a few minutes in the quiet diner. The only sounds were the hum of the big refrigerators and the creak of my stool. Bakersfield isn't exactly known for its big, dramatic moments, but today felt huge. And across town, something else was happening. The girl with the notebook, Hannah, posted Eugene's quote online. The one about not needing to go to war to be brave. Within a few hours, teachers were sharing it with their classes. A local veterans group reposted it. Somebody even printed it out on a flyer and tacked it to the community bulletin board at the library. People didn't know Eugene's whole life story, but they felt the simple, profound truth in his words. And in a small, quiet way, that truth started to move through our city. It moved into the way people greeted each other that week, with a little more care, a little less hurry. It moved into the way our regulars at Lou's started treating Marcy and the other waitresses. Bigger tips, more thank yous. It even moved into a high school history class, where a student named Andre pulled up that blurry photo of Eugene and said to his teacher, "Can we talk about people like him for a change?" Back at his house, things were just as they always were. Eugene lived alone in a small, one-story home with paint that was starting to peel and a wooden porch that creaked in all the right places. That night, he sat in his old recliner, his M65 jacket folded neatly over the back of the chair, sipping a cup of hot tea. He didn't know. He didn't know how many people had seen his face, or about the posts, or the comments, or that his name was suddenly trending in our local Google searches. And he wouldn't have cared. What mattered to him was simpler. He just hoped that maybe one person, just one, would carry what happened in the diner that morning into how they treated the next stranger they met. Because respect isn't a trend, and kindness doesn't need a camera crew. But the story wasn't over. What happened next proved that the lesson had truly stuck. By Thursday, the story was everywhere. Eugene didn't have social media. He barely even used his old flip phone, but he couldn't avoid it. When he went to the pharmacy to pick up his prescription, the cashier, a young guy with tattooed arms and a shy smile, handed him his receipt and said, "Thank you for what you did, Mr. Marshall." Eugene just blinked, confused. "What did I do?" The kid's smile got wider. "You stood up without raising your voice. My mom told me the story. She said she cried when she read it online." Eugene just gave a little shake of his head and took his bag. "I was just trying to have my breakfast." But things were different. At the grocery store, a woman in nurse's scrubs stopped him and handed him a folded card. Inside, there were no words, just a handwritten note that read, "You reminded me how powerful quiet strength can be." Outside the post office, an older man in a denim jacket saw him and just saluted. It wasn't a perfect, crisp military salute, but it was real. It meant something. And the following Sunday, when Eugene walked into Lou's diner, his usual booth was waiting for him, all cleared off, napkin and silverware set perfectly. Marcy had even put a small glass vase on the table with a single white lily in it. "Don't get used to the flowers," she joked as he walked past. "You ain't royalty." But we could all tell something fundamental had changed. He slid into the booth like he always did, but this time, when people looked over, they didn't look away. They nodded. They smiled. They spoke. A man in his 30s walked over to the table, his little boy trailing behind him. "Mr. Marshall, I just wanted to say thank you for the way you handled those kids. My son saw a clip of it online, and I used it to talk to him about how to stand up for what's right without stooping to their level." Eugene glanced down at the little boy. "What's your name, son?" "Caleb," the kid said shyly. "You treat people right, Caleb." The boy nodded seriously. "I try." Eugene smiled. "Good. The trying is the whole point." The man shook Eugene's hand, firm and grateful, and then led his son back to their table. I brought over Eugene's pie and coffee, same as always, but this time, I slid into the booth across from him. "You alright?" I asked. Eugene nodded, looking around the room. "Seems like I started something I didn't mean to." I grinned. Maybe it was something that was meant to be started. We sat in comfortable silence for a minute, and then he asked, "How's your uncle doing?" I blinked. "You remember that?" "Of course I remember. He was a brave kid." "He's good," I said, a lump forming in my throat. "He retired last year. Still talks about that picture. Still tells everyone how you saved his life." Eugene just looked out the window. We were both lucky that day. A few booths over, Hannah, the girl with the notebook, gave Eugene a little wave. He waved back. I looked at her. "She's been coming in every day since last Sunday," I told him. "Says she wants to be a journalist. Wants to talk to you more. Learn about what it means to carry something heavy and still walk tall." Eugene chuckled. "Tell her to bring stronger shoes." Later that week, I decided to host a small veterans breakfast at the diner. Nothing fancy. No speeches or news cameras. Just free pancakes, sausage, and a place for them to connect. Eugene showed up last, of course. But when he walked through that door, every single person in that packed diner stood up. It wasn't for show. It was recognition. And Troy was there. He was standing in the back, quiet, head down, hands shoved in his pockets. He didn't try to talk to anyone. At one point, I saw him walk over to Eugene's table, place a folded envelope on it, and then turn around and leave without a word. Later, Eugene opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. It said, "I disrespected someone who deserved more respect than I'll ever understand. I'm sorry. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just hoping I can be better." TD Eugene read it twice, folded it back up neatly, and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He didn't need to frame it. He didn't need to respond. The words were enough. From that day on, there wasn't a Sunday where Eugene sat alone again. People would come over, just to listen, to ask questions. And not just about Vietnam. They asked him about life, about grief, about how to keep going when the world feels too sharp and too loud. He didn't have all the answers, but he had his stories. And sometimes, that was more than enough. But there was one last moment. A quiet moment that almost got missed, that would carry the lesson from that Sunday morning even further than any of us could have expected. A week later, Bakersfield High School was holding its annual assembly for Veterans Day. Normally, it was a pretty low-key event. The principal would say a few words, they'd show a slideshow with some stock photos of flags, and a gym full of half-listening students would be itching for the bell to ring. But this year was different. It started with an email from a history teacher, a Mr. Langford. One of his students, Hannah, the girl with the notebook, had told him what happened at the diner. She showed him the quote Eugene had written down for her. Mr. Langford read it, then read it again. Something about it felt real, honest, in a way his textbooks never did. He made a phone call, then another one. By the end of the week, a single guest chair had been placed at the center of the stage in the auditorium. Eugene didn't say yes at first. He hated crowds. He didn't think of himself as some public speaker. But then Hannah showed up on his porch with a big manila envelope. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes from the students in her class, all in different colored inks and messy handwriting, all asking him to please come. He felt something shift inside him, so he said yes. On the morning of the assembly, I offered to drive him, but he wanted to walk in on his own terms. He wore his jacket, freshly pressed. His shoes were shined. And that same quiet, unbreakable posture was there, back straight, shoulders square. As he stepped into the big auditorium, a hush fell over the students. It wasn't because he looked like a celebrity. It was because there was a presence about him, a quiet dignity that made even the most restless kid in the back row sit up a little straighter. He took his seat on the stage and waited his turn. When the principal called his name, there was a beat of hesitation from the crowd, and then applause started. It wasn't thunderous. It was just real. Eugene walked to the microphone, adjusted it down to his height, and looked out at the sea of young, uncertain faces. He didn't have any notes. "I don't have much to say," he began, his voice calm and clear, "but I've got a few things that are worth hearing." Silence. I wore this jacket in a war, but it's not the war that defined who I am. It's what came after. He told them, in simple, plain words, about coming home, about losing his wife, about walking into diners just like ours and being ignored, about learning how to carry a mountain of grief without letting it crush you. And then he looked right at the kids in the front row. You don't have to wear a uniform to serve your country. You don't need a title to do the right thing. All it takes is paying attention. It takes listening. And it takes speaking up when it's easier to stay quiet. A boy in the back who had been looking at his phone slowly lowered it. A girl near the front wiped a tear from her cheek. I didn't come here today to be honored, Eugene said, his voice ringing with quiet power. I came here hoping that you'll walk out of this room and remember one thing. You don't build respect by talking louder than everyone else. You build it by standing still and offering support when someone else needs it. The room stayed quiet for a long time after he finished speaking. No loud music, no fireworks. Just hundreds of students rising to their feet, some clapping, some just thinking. Afterward, Hannah walked up to him with her notebook. Can I quote that last part? She asked. Eugene smiled at her. Only if you write it in pen. I was waiting for him out in the parking lot. I opened the passenger door for him, but he paused. Across the street, standing at a city bus stop, were 3 boys. One of them was Troy. He saw Eugene looking. He hesitated for a second, then he gave a small wave. There was no swagger in it. No grin. It was just a wave. Acknowledgement. Eugene gave a simple nod back. Nothing more was needed. I pulled the car out onto the main road as the sun started to dip behind the buildings. I have never seen a room that quiet, I said. They were really listening to you. Eugene was looking out the passenger window at the town passing by. That's the hope, he replied. And that was it. No more headlines, no more cameras. Just a moment that meant something. In a town where people had once walked past Eugene Marshall without a second glance, now they paused. Now they remembered. Now they carried his words with them. Not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. Because sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room isn't the loudest one. It's the one that speaks with quiet truth and then walks away without ever needing the applause. If this story moved you, even a little, maybe take a second today. Speak to someone who looks like they've been overlooked. Stand up when it's easier to sit down. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Because more stories like Eugene's deserve to be heard and remembered.